Welcome to Talking Industrial Automation, a podcast where you get to know the people who make modern industrial automation possible. You will get to hear from CSIA system integrators and industry partners to get a better understanding of how they help their clients solve process challenges and how they've earned success in their careers. Along the way, we will touch on system integration best practices, technology, trends, and challenges. Whether you are a manufacturer, end user, supplier, or system integrator, you will enjoy the insights these industry professionals bring to this podcast. Let's get started. Hi guys. Let me start off by apologizing for being a little late for this month's drop. My only excuse is that I'm a big girl in a big world and I have responsibilities. I was in Boston, Detroit, and Chicago, blah, blah, blah. The good news is that I have a very special episode for you. I managed to persuade my boss to let me share a bit of content from a recent CSIA members-only presentation, a virtual keynote address by Alex Chaukosky, who is Director of Analytics and Consulting for the Bundy Group. That title really does not give you the full picture, though, because he is also a super whiz when it comes to taking economic and labor data and making it understandable, non-partisan, fact-based, and more importantly, actionable. The catch is that this is only a portion of his full presentation and only audio. CSIA members can access the full presentation, including video and slides, at www.controlsys.org/virtual-keynote. But I have still included plenty of interesting insights that will help you make sense of the crazy timeline that we are living in right now. I plan to get back to the regular schedule next month, but in the meantime, please enjoy this special episode with Alex.
I appreciate you taking time to educate and keep yourself informed as well. I've enjoyed the relationship with CSA for many, many years in a variety of roles, but my goal with these presentations is to give you the information and insights to make the best quality business decisions. I titled the presentation, Driving Business Value Through Insights into Today's Economy. The focus is not only analysis, but the action that you can take. So I hope to be able to provide you with advice that is actionable, that's practical, and it's something that you can really think about implementing within your organizations after the presentation is done. We are a very proud member of the CSIA, and basically Bundy Group is a boutique investment bank. We specialize in helping business owners with a sale or a capital raise. We are very active in the M&A space, and so we can always have a conversation with you about the latest developments, what's going on with valuations. I know that that's not the focus of today's presentation, though. What we're going to talk about today, I've broken it down into 5 key areas, is really what's going on in the world around you. I'm going to separate the key elements that you should be paying attention to from the stuff that's really not that impactful from a business perspective. We'll cover the area of geopolitics. Obviously, that's on everybody's mind today. Not only things like the conflict in the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war and the conflict in the Indo-Pacific with China and Taiwan tensions, but certainly the presidential election coming up in November, as well as many state and local elections. There's a lot to process. I'm going to try to navigate that for you and show you my thoughts on a variety of subjects, and hopefully you'll find that prudent and helpful in analyzing the world as it stands today. And then we'll go into the macroeconomic update, where the economy stands today. We'll look at the leading indicator input to gauge where we're likely headed over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months into 2025. We'll wrap things up with some commentary around the state of the labor market. And throughout, but certainly at the end as well, I will provide you with that actionable and practical advice that you've come to depend on from myself and from CSIA as a great organization that provides terrific resources to its members that I'm so glad that you are taking advantage of. Buckle up, because there's a lot to cover. Let's start the process by talking about geopolitics. Geopolitics is something that is a constant in our business lives. It's something that we have been exposed to both on an individual, personal basis and from the perspective of our businesses for as long as we have been in business. Decision maker to not allow yourself to put blinders on. You've got to continue to pay attention, to really think through the potential implications of these events as they occur, not only to your personal life, but to your business life as well. And most importantly, you've got to be putting together and in place plans that you can enact given certain outcomes that will happen. This is scenario planning, this is modeling, this is strategy formulation for different outcomes. And it is something that is very much an ongoing part of your strategic decision-making process. And so I just wanted to encourage you that you don't lose track of this. I wanted to do that by giving you a few examples of the things that I think you should be paying attention to specifically right now. We'll start that conversation by looking at the supply chain and logistics disruption that's been going on. So first and foremost, this is obviously going to be focused on those companies and individual collaborators that are bringing in product from overseas. I've seen a huge upheaval in the way that product has been moving, largely because of the Houthi bombardment of ships passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is just outside Yemen's control. But the implications of that have been immense, with many companies choosing to ship product around the Cape of Good Hope. The implications are significant. Product coming from the Middle East to places like Europe, the time to get those products has been almost doubled. The cost has been significantly increased. The same thing can be said for product coming from Asia to the US coasts. Instead of a typical period of 44 days, now we're looking at 48 days, about $1,000 per transfer, additional costs incurred on an item basis for basically the goods that are coming over as a result of increased consumption of fuel, as a result of increased risk and the insurance policies that are associated with the insuring of those ships going through the various areas of the world. On the west coast of Africa, piracy is swelling right now. So it's all sorts of different increases in costs. We can see that quite clearly by looking at some of the specific routes. So I wanted to give you just a few examples recently of what it costs. For instance, to ship from Shanghai to Rotterdam, currently about 300% relative to what it was a year ago. Looking from Shanghai to Los Angeles, about 170%. Shanghai to New York, up 150%. This has implications for any company, whether you're an integrator, a distributor, or a manufacturer that's going to be bringing foreign manufactured product into the US market. So the increase has been quite significant in terms of cost, and the delays also. Sailing around Africa adds 20 to 30 days. Earlier this year, low water levels in the Panama Canal resulted in a 33% reduction in daily transits. And if you were comparing January of this year to January of 2023, Suez Canal and Panama Canal crossings are down almost 40%. Cape of Good Hope around Africa, which was up almost 60%. This is really evidence, for lack of a better word, to show you that it makes a difference on the ground in terms of time and money. And so you've got to be thinking about ways to mitigate some of those risks. And that's particularly important as we project to the future. Ask yourself, what is our strategy when it comes to managing these disruptions? And what do we do if certain scenarios come to play? If you do not have a clear-cut answer to this, I think it's a call to action. Do we have the capability to mitigate some of these risks as we look out towards our future performance? And the mitigation of these risks can certainly be quite impactful. And so I wanted to give you some suggestions here of strategies that if you're not currently doing, that you should consider implementing within your organization. And top of that list is diversification. So diversification of suppliers, shippers, manufacturing locations. One of the things that I've been talking to many of the customers that I advise is a China plus one strategy. Even as companies try to de-risk away from China, there's no way that you can avoid China as a supplier at this stage of the game. It's too important. Too much of the global manufacturing presence is in China right now. And so you cannot get away from having some sort of relationship with Chinese suppliers. But in order to diversify that risk, you should also be looking for relationships with suppliers in places like Southeast Asia. So Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, those are top of mind. But increasingly, we're seeing more focus shift to places like the Philippines and Indonesia, where there's capacity that currently doesn't exist in some of the other countries I mentioned. In addition to that, you've got to have a different part of the world in the mix. So that could be Eastern Europe, places like Poland, Czech Republic, the Baltic states, or Central and South America, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico. The best outcome is having a variety of suppliers and manufacturing locations so that you can shift and be nimble if things get significantly disrupted in one or more of them. And part of that nimbleness is robust risk assessment and planning. You've got to be a step ahead. What's going on? What implications could that have? And what are we doing? Part of the solution is technology. There are tools for real-time tracking, whether it's shipping or production volumes. Another part is having multiple shippers, and including local ones that you can go to if your global shipping gets disrupted. Constantly be looking at other options, whether it's airborne or rail, in addition to seaborne trade. And then engaging with local insurance carriers. Those guys are paying attention 100% of the time, and they can give you some great advice and insight into what's happening, where the risks are, and again, what you could be doing to mitigate some of those risks. So shipping is clearly something that you need to be paying attention to. It's part of the broader supply chain strategy that really depends on, again, that nimbleness and the ability to implement plans that are already in place when things go sideways, instead of being reactive and only then starting to develop plans. So it's a difference of proactive management versus reactive activity that some of the companies that I've engaged with have been really hurt by. Another source of disruption has been protectionism. And so that's what I want to talk about next. If we look at the global backdrop of trade restrictions, they've been on the rise. And most significantly, just in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen this huge increase in the number of trade restrictions on goods, on services, and increasingly on investments. This is correlated to a spike in geopolitical risk. It goes all the way back again to the early 2000 period. But since the disruption that began with the war in Ukraine, particularly in that global supply of goods, specific items, both industrial and consumer oriented, are very heavily concentrated in Russia and Ukraine. Now we're facing 3 potential areas: Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, and Indo-Pacific tension between China and Taiwan being 3. And that really creates a totally different mindset, both in terms of the imperatives driving thinking at various governments around the world, and in terms of what you should be expecting from a cost basis, from a disruption of trade and the inability to bring in certain products basis because they're no longer competitive in the marketplace. And that competition is what's driving all of this. So I'll give you a specific example here to drive this point home. In my view, and this view is shared by many of my colleagues in the economic analysis field, that there's very clearly a new trade war that's brewing with China. And the result of this trade war could be potentially very harmful to the economy and to companies operating in specific industries, including system integration. So let me kind of walk you through the developments here. Essentially, starting in late 2022, early 2023, the Chinese government and President Xi Jinping in particular figured that it is not viable for China to transition to consumption-based economic growth as they tried to reopen the economy post-COVID, and they saw that the mindset of the average consumer was more oriented towards saving and conservative behavior rather than spending. There was no basically rebound in demand, even though the economy was opened up in early 2023. They made a strategic decision to shift back to the modus operandi that they've been leveraging for the past several decades, which is we are going to embrace fully this notion that we are the cheap manufacturing base for the world. Starting in 2020, but certainly accelerating starting in 23, we see this huge impetus on giving more financing and more investment to the industrial sector, shifting away from the consumer sector. One of the things that resulted from that huge amount of investment is excess capacity. And the way that the Chinese government has been dealing with this excess capacity is by exporting it to the rest of the world markets. Since 2022 for the rest of the world, and what Chinese export volumes have done as a result. With mid-2024, overall exports in China are up nearly 10%, which when you think about the fact that China both consumes and produces, roughly speaking, 50% of many, many product categories in the marketplace today, that's a significant increase. And we're already starting to see real harm being done to specific sectors. On that export growth, you can see things like steel up 100% year over year, solar panels and photovoltaic cells and all of the components related to energy production from solar up 125%, and EV exports, you can see, are up 175%. And there are many other categories. These are just examples, but I want you to see here that decision to shift to exporting that excess production to the rest of the globe is very purposeful. It's done with knowledge of the fact that it's likely to elicit a response from trading partners. And certainly we've seen rhetoric from not only President Trump that's vying to increase tariffs by a significant amount, which we'll talk on a little bit later in the presentation. The Biden administration and Kamala Harris have also not only not taken off the tariffs that Trump put in during his first time in office, but they've actually increased tariffs in several key important categories. So the reality is, as we look out to the future, protectionism and increasing trade restrictions are just going to be part of the mix. The question just remains, how severe does it get depending on the outcome of the presidential election? There are strategies that you can implement that could result in quite substantial savings for you if this thing evolves as we expect it to, with continuing increases in net protectionist policy. Companies implementing strategic tariff mitigation strategies an average savings of nearly 60% on tariffs of goods coming in the US using specific tools and strategies. You don't just have to throw your hands up and say, well, I guess I'm just going to have to eat higher costs and pass those higher costs on to my customers. No, there are things like strategic sourcing, product exclusion requests, adjustments to the country of origin, which some creative machinations involved there, first sale tactics, foreign trade zones, all sorts of different techniques that can be leveraged to offset the most harmful impact of this trade restriction and tariff policy that is likely going to be in our future in 2025 and beyond. With shipping and supply chain concerns, this is something that you've got to be looking at on an ongoing basis. You've got to understand exactly what the outcome will be if certain tariffs come into play. So currently, President Trump is touting 10% tariffs on anything coming into the US, upwards of 20% potentially, and then 60% tariffs on products coming from China. What will happen to your business if that comes to pass? Do you understand the ramifications other than knowing I'm going to have to pay higher? Look at your top line, look at your bottom line, understand the propensity to be able to pass some of those price increases along, and then create plans that you can implement whatever happens in the future.
Let me ask you a question. Don't get mad. How many people in your life truly understand what it is that you do? I'm willing to guess the answer is not too many. I get it. So many of us toil in anonymity. But what if I told you that I have a place where you can go to meet and talk and commiserate with people who do understand what you do because they do the same thing? Amazing, I know. But that's really the bottom line what CSIA is all about. And recently, we've expanded our learning and networking opportunities to help you find your people. We are calling them special interest groups. These groups are aligned around topics such as emerging leaders or marketing, and they meet virtually throughout the year with some plans for meeting in person as well, probably in conjunction with the CSIA annual conference. We will be bringing more online throughout the year, but for now, if either of those topics sound interesting, go to www.controlsys.org/events to check out what we have lined up. Full disclosure, you do need to be a member of CSIA to join the marketing SIG, but the emerging leaders one is open to anyone who wants to give it a try. So why not take a minute and check out the upcoming schedule at www.controlsys.org/events. Your people are waiting.
let's look at U.S. economic performance. And I want to start by looking at the macroeconomy. This is real, which is inflation-adjusted GDP. And I think that this is really key to understand. I mean, we are currently at an absolute record high in terms of our inflation-adjusted GDP. That means that the amount of economic activity in the United States has never been higher. Now, that at face value is very, very positive. I recognize that face value doesn't always give you the full story. And so when you're looking at economic data, you've got to look at not just the actual dollars being spent, but the kind of hidden vital signs of the economy. And we do that in the economic circles by looking at the business cycle, looking at it as a growth rate plotted over time, rather than just the absolute value of the dollars spent. It's the vital sign of the economy. Right now, we're up 3.1%. That's taking the second quarter GDP number, comparing it to the second quarter of 2023, above the historic average of about 2% growth. So the economy for the last year has been outperforming expectations. Our macroeconomy, reflected by real inflation-adjusted GDP, is doing well. Midway through 2024, we're expecting growth to slow to about 2% for the third quarter. That data is going to come out in the next few weeks, but there's no cliff that we're expecting this to go off of. There's no imminent recession that is likely to happen in the next 6 months in the United States. So all the way out into early 2025, there's no evidence that we're going to go recessionary relative to where we are right now. To gauge things further into the future, we have to understand how the economy breaks down. And in most simplistic terms, it is you and I as individual consumers and the money we spend living our daily lives that is the biggest growth engine for U.S. economic performance. Personal consumption accounts for almost 2/3 of overall GDP. The other two categories are government spending and business investment, each roughly 17%. But the reality is government spending doesn't fluctuate that much. It is basically recession-proof. It's all appropriated and budgeted in advance, and then those budgets are doled out over time. We very rarely see cuts in government spending, at least at the total level. So that sustains some economic activity on an ongoing basis, especially if you are contracting with government entities, if you're on the military and defense side of things, if you're on the aerospace side of things. A lot of that money is kind of locked in. Now, what is not locked in and what is reflected by that business investment suffering quite a bit from high interest rates and borrowing costs. The business investment sentiment, or B side, has been performing poorer than the consumer side. Let's look at those elements in detail, starting with the personal consumption piece. One of the best ways for me to illustrate the state of the consumption, particularly for U.S. consumers, is by looking at this series called Retail, Trade, and Food Services. As you can see, it's a very large economic series, about $8.5 trillion over the last 12 months. So almost a third of overall economic performance reflected by this series alone. And where we stand today is actually quite in a good space. What most people don't realize is just how different it is relative to where we were pre-pandemic. So if you look at the 10-year period between 2010, when we were recovering from the Great Recession, and 2020, the onset of COVID, this is the trend line of basically up and to the right, roughly speaking, 2.5% year over year. We shut down the economy in Q2 of 2020, creating this chasm that is reflective of the COVID shutdown, where we could not actually go out and spend the money that we had, including the extra money that we were receiving from the government at that time. Now, once those restrictions were lifted, we engaged in something that I affectionately call the revenge shopping spree. We really went out of our way to go out and spend as much money as possible, as quickly as we could, exacerbating some of the supply chain bottlenecks and long lead times and all of the things that were plaguing performance during that 21-22 timeframe. But now that things have normalized a little bit, what you'll see is that this new normal is actually quite similar. And the reason for that, ladies and gentlemen, is because we are paying, on average, somewhere between 20 and 30% more for all the products that we buy and services that we consume across the board over the last 3 to 4 years. So this new higher baseline, although the growth is happening at a similar level as what we were seeing here, now it's happening from a much higher base level because of the higher prices. Again, face value of the retail environment looks good. No major concerns there. If we look at the retail trend from a business cycle basis, what we see is that specific normalization that I mentioned just a second ago. The rebound from the pandemic recession was so great that it was never going to be sustainable for the long term. Year over year, we peaked at, roughly speaking, 20% growth. Now, our economy is not set up to sustain 20% growth in retail forever. This deceleration over the last 4 years or so was always going to happen. What I take great comfort from is that right now, we're roughly speaking back on a similar level that we witnessed during that healthy period of economic expansion from 2010 to 2020, roughly speaking, growing about 2.5% to 3% per year in retail. There's no sign of a consumer recession. The last data point for retail sales in the month of September was above expectations. So we continue to find ways to go out there and spend money. And so that large chunk of the overall economy that's accounting for 2/3 of overall economic activity, the personal consumption element, is not under significant strain right now. That doesn't mean that there aren't warning signs being flashed. And those warning signs are very important to pay ongoing attention to. Most of those warning signs have to do with how much debt the US consumer has. To assess where we really stand relative to the ability that we have to continue spending money, I think we've got to look at that debt. It is very normal for American consumer debt to increase over time. The latest data we have is through Q2 of 2024. We currently stand at $17.76 trillion of overall American consumer debt. Now, most people, and there are many articles that cover this, freak out. They say, consumer debt levels hit a record high once again. Well, of course they do, because we are a credit-driven society. We have a growing population. And so the overall level of debt is likely going to continue to increase. That in and of itself is not the issue. The issue is, are we able to keep up with the payments on that debt or not? What really brings me comfort is looking at the fact that mortgages and home equity line of credit comprise 72% of the total debt load, and those are not problematic from an interest rate environment. 75% of mortgages are locked in below 5%, more than half have a rate below 4%, about a quarter are below 3%, and there is about a quarter of housing is fully paid off. 3/4 of overall debt is very manageable. It's locked in at a fixed interest rate that tends to be quite low. The other categories, on the other hand, auto loans, credit cards, and student loans, warrant further exploration. When managing overall debt, we measure that is by looking at delinquencies, meaning are people able to keep making those payments or are they behind on those payments? Overall delinquencies through Q2 remain low, just above 3%. Pre-pandemic, it was very normal for multiple years for delinquencies to be running at somewhere around 5%. So overall debt, not a major issue right now, at least as it comes to our ability to make payments on that debt. Now, looking at the delinquencies of individual categories, I think is vitally important to start to sense where are problem areas emerging. And what we see here is that the two really concerning spaces are credit cards and auto loans. When the government lifted the moratorium on student debt payments, that all of a sudden that was going to be the straw that broke the camel's back and sends US into recession. That did not happen because of the gradual ramp up of those payments that the administration was able to put into place. The delinquencies on student debt remain extremely low. We cannot say the same thing for credit cards and auto loans. In particular, I'm concerned about the credit card delinquency rate now at about 9%. That 9% figure is quite a bit higher than the area we were, which was more in the 6% range here in the pre-pandemic period. And I think that that's very, very key because, in order to continue to spend money, we've got to have low delinquency rates on credit cards. And as of right now, we don't have that. So I think in the near term, this could potentially start causing the consumer to pull back. We've already seen the changes in terms of being much more preferential and choosing needed items over nice to have items, choosing kind of baseline goods over luxury goods. Some of that behavior is already starting to come out. We're seeing it in some of the biggest retailers, Target, Costco, Dollar General, Walmart. Certainly, all of these areas are seeing a shift in consumer preferences to cheaper baseline goods away from luxury goods. On the auto loan side, I was encouraged to see it did tick down with the latest report. It's not something I'm as worried about relative to credit cards, but really both of these tend to be quite elevated relative to where we were just a couple of years ago. So it warrants watching. I'm not saying that this is the canary in the coal mine that means that we are going to get into recession, but hopefully, as the Fed continues with its easing policy, where they've already cut rates by 0.5% and have signaled that they will continue to cut rates to get interest rate policy away from the restrictive area where it's been for the last 2 years, more to neutral or accommodative, means they probably have to cut the federal funds rate by 1.5% before we get to that space. As those interest rates come down, I'm hoping that will correlate to slowing or possibly declining delinquency rates on credit cards and autos. Shifting to the business side of the economy, where most CSIA members play. This is your market, this is your world, this is where the demand comes from. And the industrial economy has not been doing nearly as well as the consumer economy. The US Industrial Production Index, which is kind of the benchmark for the B2B economy, the actual value of the index, which measures volume of production rather than the dollars associated with production, has been flat with a mild downside since early 2023. So we're now going on nearly 2 years of basically no industrial sector growth in the United States. Now, that's not broadly applicable. There are sectors of opportunity, aerospace, defense, medical. You look at some other pockets, anything related to semiconductors, manufacturing, construction, power generation, construction. The industrial sector of the US economy has been flat for nearly 2 years now. We can see that manifests itself in the data on the business cycle side as well. The quarterly number at 0.1% means that while there is a mild contraction trend visible, you don't have a significant amount of further downside pressure. So things are likely to either stay the same or get better in the next 3 to 6 months when it comes to the industrial economy. When we couple that with the notion that cost of capital likely decreasing and investment has been put off in many cases with companies not choosing to buy new equipment, install new facilities as a result of these high costs, pressure on business to business side of the economy. One element that I wanted to just very briefly cover, which is the control system integration market, is highly coveted by potential buyers. Buyer behavior has been much more limited, particularly on the private equity side, in terms of looking for those good companies not offering valuations that are totally detached from reasonable levels. Many got burned by offering crazy valuations during the era of cheap money, particularly in that 21-22 timeframe. They are more selective right now. But if your business is well diversified, if it's coupled with the attractive nature of the industry itself, there can still be great opportunities. The key is running a full competitive buying process. But one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is a one-to-one transaction. So you have a small to medium-sized organization, there's a strategic buyer, they come in with an offer, and then the transaction is done. No, you've got to go to the market to see what the true market value is to realize the best outcome. But the key element here is run your business as if you're going to sell it, whether you're planning on selling it or not. There are principles on building value in organizations that pay off over time. So you couple that with the nature of the industry that's being very attractive and continue to expect consolidation to accelerate as boomers exit and realize benefits of their work. The very last thing that I wanted to touch on is the labor market. We are long past the Great Resignation. The labor market has definitely cooled and normalized now. September, surprise to the upside, we saw 254,000 jobs added, but most were in key segments, not industrials, healthcare, education, leisure and hospitality, It is things like government services. Manufacturing, for example, lost 7,000 jobs in the month of September. The unemployment rate did come down slightly to 4.1%, but with that, the devil is in the details. You've got to really look at key positions and what the unemployment rate for those roles is. We'll do that in just a second. Average hourly earnings are currently up 4% year over year. So the implications here are cost of living adjustments for your people, reflecting a higher inflation environment, and the fact that average hourly earnings are up 4% need to be somewhere in that 3 to 5% range. 2% is no longer enough on COLA. Digging deeper on the unemployment side, yes, the overall unemployment rate is 4.1%, but the positions that CSIA members are often trying to fill have a very different picture. Architecture and engineering, current unemployment rate in that space, 1.7%. Installation, maintenance, and repair technicians, 1.8%. So it's very easy to buy into the top line numbers, but if you're actually looking to hire people, mid-level management is another good example, just 2%. If you're looking to hire a good people manager, it's going to be more difficult than this national unemployment rate would suggest. In addition, there is ample evidence that there is still a premium between people that stay in their current jobs and people that switch jobs. Now, that premium has shrunk substantially. So you can see here, through September, job changers are seeing wage increases of 6.6%, job stayers, 4.7%. The acknowledgement here is people have to focus on retention. And you as a business leader, companies must retain the top talent that they have. You cannot afford for your people to jump. And given the low unemployment for engineering, for installation, and for management positions, those are the roles where I would focus your effort when it comes to retention. Let's wrap it up. As we look out towards 2025, I do believe that there will be an improvement in conditions, in particular, as we get past the uncertainty related to the political environment. And this has been the case for previous elections as well. Business leaders in particular adopt very much a wait and see posture. They are not wanting to commit themselves to major expenditures or projects until they have more visibility in terms of what policy will look like. So I'm hoping that we have a smooth process in November. Even though I am personally expecting some delays, I am very hopeful that we do not have a similar situation as what we experienced during the last election, that the transition of power to whichever candidate happens smoothly, and then we get a little bit more clarity in terms of what the policy of the next administration is likely to be like. Once we have that in place and combined with the likelihood of lower interest rates, I do think that the environment for system integrators should see an improvement as we get into 2025.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Talking Industrial Automation. If you're interested in learning more about Alex, you can find him on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also really help the show by leaving a review and sharing with colleagues. We're all just slaves to the logarithm now, so I gotta ask. Thanks for listening to the Talking Industrial Automation podcast. Thanks also to bensound.com and Wistia for the music bumpers. Until next time.